Is that a signal from the United States that we still mean business?
Well, let me start again. Biden had to live up to some of the words he issued at his otherwise lamentable press conference on Thursday night in Washington, D.C., when he said, "We will hunt you down." So we've seen a drone go up, a Reaper drone, as they're called, go up in the air and take this guy out, whom they'd already spotted long ago. But I think that the notion of hunting down terrorists, which was the reason for going into Afghanistan in the first place 20 years ago, only underlines the irony and the tragedy and the ignominy of this withdrawal from Kabul. Because make no mistake, Alastair, this is a huge political and military defeat, not only for the United States, but for NATO and for the United Kingdom, the next biggest military contributor after the Americans. And what the repercussions will be are wholly unclear. I could have a really good discussion with you about some of the possibilities. But terrorism is back if the Taliban allow ISIS-K to develop their bases in the country. And that is by no means a given.
Have a go at that bit in the middle that you said we could have a long, long chat about it, a brief one. What do you think all of that tells you about America's view of America's place in the world? 1930s isolationism again?
No, I don't think 1930s isolationism again. And I don't also think that this is the end of intervention abroad if American interests are touched. What it is the end of, and thank God, is nation building and social engineering out of the barrel of a gun. Because in my view, the worm in the apple of the Afghan intervention back in 2021 was not whacking al-Qaeda. They deserved a punitive expedition. It wasn't driving the Taliban out of power, along with the so-called Northern Alliance of other ethnic groups in Afghanistan. It was when the mission in Afghanistan morphed almost imperceptibly from being a punitive expedition to building a nation in the image of the West and Western values against the entire grain of Afghan history and Afghan culture. And that is this worm that has undermined the entire operation for the last 20 years, and I may say so, doomed it to failure.
Absolutely fascinating. Take you one step back. I mean, we've talked about this in the past. The Cold War was as much a moral crusade as it was a military standoff with mutually assured destruction. God forbid should either of them press the button. But the new Russia and the emerging might of China and her economy must be looking at all of this, and Biden and Trump before him, and rubbing their hands, counting the cash, extending their influence.
Well, you might say that, but I would enter two qualifying arguments here. The presence of a vacuum in Afghanistan, the defeat for the Americans, will give joy to a lot of people in Beijing and Moscow. But nature abhors a vacuum. And if we're going to see a vacuum in Afghanistan of uncontrolled civil war because the Taliban can't hold the nation down as they couldn't 20 years ago, then this is also advantageous to these countries, but also worrying. If you're sitting in Moscow and you see uncontrolled warfare around jihadism inside Afghanistan, you start to wonder, is this stuff going to travel through Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and all the other stans and reach the borders of Russia and get into Chechnya, where the Russians have fought at least 2 wars in the last generation? If you're Chinese, you're thinking to yourself, is all this stuff going to cross the border into China? Is it going to infect the Uyghurs, who are causing us enough trouble already, according to President Xi? So there are advantages from what has happened to the United States. But if I was sitting in Beijing, sitting in Moscow, which has already had its tail burnt with an Afghan intervention back in the 80s, if I was sitting even in Pakistan, I would worry a lot about the uncontrolled nature of what may develop in Afghanistan, plus the huge risks of intervening from the outside. Because one thing we have learned from Alexander the Great in God knows when BC, I've forgotten now, 3 British-Afghan wars, 2 in the 19th century, one just after the First World War, that the foreign invader and intruder always comes to grief. And that, I'm afraid, is what's happened to NATO, the United States, and the UK.
Final point. Where do you believe that all of this leaves the United Kingdom, Great Britain, in the future world order, if it's not, as you say, perhaps not a new world order in that sense, but it's a future that still has G7, where we looked pretty poorly. It still has NATO, where if America didn't want to play, everybody else might just as well go home as well. The Prime Minister talks about global Britain. Is that now looking like a precarious joke?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, tell me when we have not been global Britain. I mean, it's since when, let's say, since the beginning of the 18th century, let's be approximate and rough here, Britain has been attracted by the globe, commercially, economically, militarily, politically. That is in our blood. Sometimes our vocation has tended towards Europe. Sometimes it's tended to, what do they call it, the blue waters. And maybe we are now in a blue waters phase when we shall look to develop our interests and protect them in a wider world than the European Union. That would be, to use the phrase I used earlier on, entirely with the grain of our last 250 years of history. So I'm not terribly anxious about global Britain. And of course, all the old Romaniacs still frothing out there like loonies. I include myself among them because I voted to remain. All the frothing Romaniacs are saying, global Britain, it's a load of cobblers. That's all right, isn't it? It's a load of cobblers. And it's a typical Brexit thing. It is not a typical Brexit thing. It's been part of the fabric of British foreign policy for a very, very long time, well before Boris and Brexit.
Onward and upward. Sir Christopher Meyer, a real pleasure.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.